All right, so we've got Patrick and Tom coming up. So this particular presentation, whenever we were setting it up and kind of thinking about it, going through the talks, we really liked this one because I believe that most people think that penetration testing and running a red team is, just basically all fun and shenanigans all day long. And while it is a lot of fun and it is an amazing career path, there's a tremendous amount of infrastructure and kind of background and support that you have to give your testers, and things that make them successful rather than trying to reinvent the wheel every single time. Patrick, Tom, take it away.
Thank you, everyone, for coming to how to build a high-performing red team. Really appreciate everyone who's attending. I know this has been an interesting change of venue. And on that note, also a big shout out to the organizers for doing this. I know that they probably jumped through a lot of last-minute hoops to try to make this happen and make what they thought was the best decision for everyone. And I have a lot of respect for what they did to make this happen. So big thank you to everyone who put this on. So I'm Patrick Fussell. I'm a member of X-Force Red's Red Team. I've been working in Infosec in one form or another for about 9 years. Spoken at quite a few conferences. I've been at Hackfest, NOLACon, B-Sides LV, GERCon, just to touch on a few of them. However, I started my professional life as a Marine after graduating from the College of Charleston in 2006.
I'm Tom Porter, a member of the Fusion X Red Team. I've been there for a few years now. You might know me from some Bloodhound extensions that I've authored and a geolocation-based word list generation tool for hash cracking. You can find me at Porterhouse on Twitter and Bloodhound Slack, as well as Discord. So Patrick and I are going to keep an eye on Discord throughout the talks. You guys have questions, comments, throw them in that Track 1 Talks channel. We'll try to circle back to those at the end. Prior to my InfoSec career, I was a pitcher in the San Diego Padres organization. So I was drafted back in 2009, and I played professionally for a little while before I actually went out and got a real job. Now, the reason that Patrick and I mentioned our previous careers here, and we chose these particular pictures from 10 plus years ago, is because we realized that Patrick's background as a Marine and mine as an athlete had a lot of overlap with what we do now as red teamers. So we had these team-based, high-stressed experiences where we found a lot of common ground. So Patrick and I worked together previously at a PCI-based penetration testing firm where we worked there for a number of years. And one of our favorite topics of conversation was the effectiveness of our team. So, where were we strong and why were we strong in those areas? And what areas were we weak and how could we shore those up? And when we did that, oftentimes we came back to this question: what makes a red team effective? Now, first of all, why do we even care what makes a red team effective? And to us, we think it's fairly simple. We like to see happier people. We want to see people grow in their careers professionally. We want to see stronger teams. We want to see better work environments, and we want to see the industry grow and evolve. And we think effective red teams move towards that goal. Now, there's a million different ways you could approach trying to answer this question. The thing that jumped out to Patrick and I first was kind of the red team aspect of it. So from our backgrounds, we were members of high-performing groups. We operated in stressful environments, and we had a shared mission with our team members. Your failure to know and execute your role meant failure for the team. And that's a heavy burden to place on yourself, especially when you're operating like in the capacity that Patrick was in the military. But with that heavy burden comes a lot of hard lessons learned, and we'll share some of those today. You might focus on the what aspect, so maybe what's at a red team's disposal. Things like their TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures. While we think those are important, we think they're more of a result. They're a result of other foundational elements of that team, like the core principles, the team's culture, and just how they're organizationally structured. Is your team laid out in a way that supports communication and growth and accountability? How rigorous is your hiring process? How well do leaders balance the dichotomy between discipline and autonomy for their operators? And lastly, you might focus on the effective part of this and how we define that. And you might look at maybe quantitative metrics, things like client retention rate or revenue or growth or success rate or some other key performance indicator, whether factor you want to focus on. But there's other things that play into that equation. What about the relationships that you built with your client? What about the relationships and communication channels you've built within your organization across different departments? And what about alignment? How closely are your team's actions and results aligned with the organization's overall mission? And when the engagement's over, how do you take that knowledge and that experience that you just gained and feed it back into the team so you can encourage growth and forward progress for everyone? So we're going to explore these topics today, and this is Patrick and I's humble attempt at trying to answer this question. And it's a combination of the people we've interviewed and interacted with over the years, some books and research that we've done within the Infosec space and as well as outside of it in other disciplines, and just partially our own experience as members of various successful teams. And we hope that when you walk away from this virtual talk today, maybe you have a couple notes that you can take back to your team and start talking about and implementing. So we've broken this talk into 3 different sections. The first one here is the Red Team mission. I'll talk about what that means, how it plays into mission scope, and just why we do what we do as Red Teamers. And to illustrate that why, I'm going to tell you a story about where I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, and playing baseball. So I played baseball competitively since I was a little kid up through high school. And I decided I want to try to advance my career to maybe go into the collegiate ranks or even play professionally one day. So I sought out a group that would help me do that. And I came across this organization called the On Deck Baseball and Softball Development Academy. Started by this guy that you see there on the right. His name is Mike Schilt. Now, the purpose of On Deck was to kind of develop and train young players and put them in front of college and pro scouts and play across the country in different tournaments. And hopefully these kids would get developed and put in a position to where they could get a scholarship or maybe they could get drafted. Now, about Mike, he grew up in Charlotte too. His mom was an assistant to the owner of the Charlotte O's, which was the AA affiliate of the Baltimore Orioles. And this was Charlotte's minor league baseball team at the time. And so as an 8-year-old, Mike went to the ballpark every day. He shagged fly balls with the players. He shined their shoes. He operated the scoreboard during the game. And his mom was the one who brought him to the park. And she really fostered that relationship that he had with baseball and the players. And that's where Mike's initial passion for the sport began. He got really close with the players, and he decided then that he wanted to try to become a Major League Baseball player. And it reminded me a lot of my relationship with my dad. And maybe many of you out there feel something similar. I had a similar experience with someone you know. Where I remember sitting in my dad's lap as a little kid, and we're at the computer, and we're playing things like Heroes of Might and Magic. Or he got me, I don't know if you guys remember those Lego Mindstorm sets. Those little programmable robots from Lego you could play around with, and we had a blast doing that. And it kind of sparked that interest in me of computers and problem solving and programming. And I had no idea where I was going to end up. I had no idea I would be doing Infosec today. I didn't even know what Infosec was until my World of Warcraft account got hacked when I was still playing baseball in college. But it was an interest that I pursued, and this is where it took me. Similarly to Mike, he decided to pursue that passion of playing Major League Baseball. So he went and played baseball at UNC Asheville, and that was it. That's where his career fizzled out as a player. He realized he was a below average baseball player. So he shifted focus over to coaching. He coached for a high school in Charlotte. He then coached for UNC Asheville at his alma mater, and he coached at UNC Charlotte. Eventually, he decided to break off and create On Deck. If you ran into Mike in the hallways of On Deck, you could tell he was a pretty mild-mannered guy. But once you got into a dugout with Mike, you could see a switch flip, and this passion came out. And I still haven't met a man that was more passionate about baseball than he was. And his passion for the sport is what led him to create On Deck. It was the purpose that was implied with the name of the academy. For those of you unfamiliar with baseball terminology, the on deck circle is where a hitter who's next up in the order prepares for their at-bat. And that's what Mike wanted to do with Charlotte's youth. He wanted to prepare them for the next level, whether it was in baseball or life. To do that, he created these 6 different principles. And if you walk in the front door of the On Deck offices in South Charlotte, you'll see this hanging up on the wall. And this is a screen grab from one of the local Charlotte news broadcasts. Laid out, they look like this: leadership, respect, making a difference, integrity, service, and commitment. And if you look at the language associated with those 6 things, you see things like we raise the bar, we set the standard, we are dependable, we want to make our community a better place. Now, by looking at this, you would have no idea it was associated with the baseball development program. But these are the principles. Mike realized these are principles that were applicable to any industry or any discipline. They were transferable skills. And it didn't take talent to live up to these things. It only took discipline. Now, if you turn to the left, you would see this wall that had a bunch of the players that were currently going through the program. And on down the hallway were players from the past 2 decades that have gone through the program. So each of these shows a player, their current school, and then where they went on to play either in college or in the professional ranks. So you see things like Duke University, some other colleges there in the Southeast, and as well as some of the professional programs. But this wall served two particular purposes. One, for each athlete that came through that building, it reminded them of the mission, what they were there trying to accomplish. And On Deck was not afraid to tell their story of what they were doing. And secondly, it connected these players with the present, with where they were, and the future with where they wanted to be. It helped them visualize success, and it helped provide a target for them to move towards. And I realized this when I was walking through the offices of FusionX where we work. So up in Arlington, Virginia, in the FusionX space of the office, when you walk in the door, you see this. So you see some of the cool projects that some of our guys have built, an arcade machine. You see a demo that we've built to simulate blowing up an oil refinery. And on the left-hand side, you see a sample of some of the placards that we hang around the office. And these placards tell stories of FusionX and what they've done on some of their past adversary simulations. Things like having your finger on the light switch of millions of homes, or how we stole money simultaneously from multiple casinos. So whenever I walk into the office, I see these things, and it reminds me of what we're there to do. It reminds me of the caliber of people that I work with, and it pushes me just a little bit harder to be better. So going back to Mike, this is where his story really gets interesting. In 2004, he sold On Deck, and he went on to pursue his passion professionally with the St. Louis Cardinals as a scout. And he did that for 5 years, and then they gave him a shot at managing the rookie-level minor league team, and he won 2 championships there. Then they bumped him up to AA, and he won a championship there, and was named Team of the Year by Baseball America. They bumped him up to AAA, just one step away from the big leagues, and he became a AAA All-Star coach. 2 years later, they actually bumped him up to the big leagues as an assistant coach. Then he got bumped up to the third base coach, and then in 2018, he was the bench coach, which is essentially the right-hand man of the manager, Mike Matheny. Halfway through the 2018 season, the Cardinals fired their manager, Mike Matheny, and they named Mike Schilt the interim manager. Over the next month and a half, he led the Cardinals to the best record in baseball. They decided to remove that interim title. They made him the full-time manager, and they gave him a 3-year contract extension. After the season was over, MLB Network, they have live presentations where they hand out awards, and he won National League Manager of the Year. There's a link here at the bottom. I'll post this in Discord. If you guys have 2 minutes in between talks or sometime tomorrow or wherever it may be, I encourage you to go check out this interview, because you can see Mike receiving this award live. And you'll see Mike talk about all the things that we just mentioned here in this talk. He talks about how this award was, even though it's an individual award, it was for the team, it was for the organization, it was for the players. He just is the recipient of it because he was part of the movement to get the team to achieve their mission, and that was what his goal was. You can see him credit his mom and his upbringing and sparking that passion and that interest in him. And that's what it was. It was Mike finding his why. He had no idea that he would end up where he is today, but he took those principles that he hung up on the wall at On Deck, and he embodied them, and he beaconed them to the rest of the players and coaches around him. And they followed him, and they found success. So I'm going to look at the why a little more abstractly. And this is from Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why. And in there, he has this notion of a golden circle. And it represents how organizations and teams and leaders think, act, communicate. So on the outermost ring would be the what. And members of a team organization know what they do. We sell widgets, we perform adversary simulations. Fewer people on the team understand how they do it. And this is your differentiator. This is what sets you apart from your competition. So we perform adversary simulations. We're really good at it, and clients love us. It's not a really inspiring sales pitch, but that's how people tend to process this kind of information. His argument throughout the text is that the organizations and teams and leaders out there that start on the inside with why, they're the ones that tend to innovate and inspire and find success. And they work their way out from there. So to think about this in a red teaming context, I'm going to level set on definitions. And the one I chose is from Joe Vest. And I first saw it there at the blog you see linked at the bottom. But it's my favorite definition that I've come across for red teaming. And in that blog post, he has this graph that you see that kind of shows you the difference between red teaming versus penetration testing versus vulnerability assessments, and the difference between depth and breadth of them, and how red teaming is more geared towards sophisticated organizations. Just like how you wouldn't have honeypots deployed before you have patch management process in place, You wouldn't do red teaming until you've got your vulnerability assessments and your penetration down pat. Now, that definition is red teaming is a process of using tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs, to emulate a real-world threat with the goals of training and measuring the effectiveness of people, processes, and technology used to defend an environment. Now, the reason I like this definition so much is because it hits on those three things that we just talked about. What is red teaming? It's, in Infosec sense, it's emulating a real-world threat. How do we do it? By mimicking that threat's TTPs. But why do we do it? Well, it's two goals. We want to measure and train the effectiveness of the people, processes, and technologies used to defend an environment. And you can take this definition and pick it up and apply it to whatever industry your client or your organization might be in, as long as you add a little bit of empathy with it. So if you're in the financial services district, you could say, I want to protect the credit of my family and friends so they can go out and one day buy a house. Or maybe if you're in the telecom industry, I want to protect against SIM swapping attacks so my wife, her online identity doesn't get wiped out. Joe and James released this book, Red Team Development Operations, back in January. It's out on Amazon. If you haven't checked it out yet, I encourage that you do. It's a great read. So also going to level set on mission scope. So you'll hear Patrick and I refer to different missions throughout the talk, and it depends on context what we're talking about. So typically there's two different contexts for missions. The first being the overall strategic vision. And this would be usually aligned with your organization's mission statement. It's kind of the big picture of what you want to accomplish as an organization. And to do that, you have smaller tactical missions with tangible objectives. So when we're talking about red teaming, we're usually talking about this level of scope as we move from client to client or engagement to engagement. Now, when it comes to communicating all of this down to your team, it's important that you deliver in these two critical areas, the mission and the intent. The mission being what we just described. So we want to describe that overall strategic vision, and we want to describe what achieving those tactical objectives looks like. And you couple that with the intent behind it, that purpose. The why are we doing this? And if you give that along with the desired end state, what does that look like? It gives your frontline troops, your red team operators, a goal, and allows them to take those risks that are necessary to achieve that mission. If they know their left and right bounds of authority when it comes to decision making, they can make those decisions without pestering upper management, and it gives them some autonomy to operate in that space. So some of the key takeaways from this first section: firstly, find that why, believe in the mission, understand it, and communicate it. If you don't understand the mission and if you can't communicate it down, how can you expect the people in the chain below you to understand it? So buy into it, and makes the others below you easier to buy into. Secondly, if you want your team to move towards a target, you have to give them a target. So find those priorities, name them, rank them, and then this will get everyone focused and moving in the same direction. And then lastly, help that team visualize what success looks like in your environment. So flood the environment with reminders of successes that demonstrate the purpose of the mission. Help them connect the present with where we are, with the future and where we want to be. So with that, I will kick it back over to Patrick.
All right, excellent. Through cat memes. And I just noticed that Tom added a nice note in my speaker notes, so appreciate that, Tom. What do cat memes have to do with building a team? Obviously, the answer is nothing, but I felt like we had done the whole presentation. We had no cat memes, and this was the only place I could find to stick one. So check that one off the list. Something that's integral to how a team operates and performs is culture. But what is culture in the context of a team? I think if you were to look up the dictionary definition of culture, it falls a little bit short of capturing the nuances of what is a team's culture. So I did a little Googling around, and this is the definition that really struck a chord for me. It captures this idea of the million little things that you do from minute to minute or hour to hour that really define what the team is. You think about any team or organization that you've been a part of, be it good or bad, how would you describe that culture to an outsider? What are the first things that come to mind when you contemplate that particular group's culture? Maybe it's a culture of excellence, or maybe they just had overall apathy. You'll see it's kind of often a lot of little things that make up that overall feel of the team. Why is this important? Well, you want your team's culture to contribute to a success and be one that improves the lives of its members. So one of my first schools in the Marine Corps, I encountered what I think is my first instance of an organization that really had a culture of we strive to always do things the right way. And in retrospect, what I've noticed is that mindset stemmed from the leadership of the commander of that particular school. I noticed he did lots of things that he always pushed a little bit harder than everyone would maybe really have want to be pushed. He did things like lots of super early physical training that was particularly challenging, regular room inspections, uniform inspections, strong accountability for leadership at all levels. These are all things that maybe he didn't necessarily have to do. But in general, he had a very consistent high expectations for everyone's level of performance. Now, the result of this is every member of the unit internalized that mindset and carried it over into everything they did, not just where this commander has oversight. They understood that the group benefited when each individual tried to hold themselves to a higher standard of operating. This sort of spillover effect made the entire unit really stand out as being excellent, or what you might call a culture of excellence. Earlier, Tom mentioned that he and I worked together at a pen testing firm several years ago. And looking back on it, one of the questions that came up is, what's the difference between being employed and actually being part of a team? When we were working at this company, when we first got hired on, or as we were getting started, it was very much a standard of every man for himself. Not a lot of defined standards or procedures. Every engagement was executed solo. It was a fully remote team, and we didn't have a lot of incentive to work together to get anything done. So we were getting work done, but it wasn't focused on making the team better or contributing to the team in any way. So fortunately, over time, we saw a lot of maturity grow into the team, and it really turned into what I would describe as a cohesive unit. So what changed? An early change that I saw that was particularly impactful was just improved communications. We were fully remote, so really that initial step was deploying a really robust chat application. And it's not just a chat application that was important, it's what it did. And that was, I think, one of the most impactful things was give the team a place to bullshit. Allow the team members to develop relationships that otherwise weren't in place. That makes it a lot easier to do things like ask for help. It also helps improve insight into how is everybody else operating. Something as simple as saying, hey, how are you guys handling X, Y, Z situation? This lets everyone share ideas and practices, which leads to development of maybe standard operating practices. So you're getting something consistent from the team. Some other changes stem from the leadership style of our manager. He was definitely an enabler more than a typical manager. Instead of do what I say, he was more likely to say, what do you need to be successful? This made it easy to give him feedback, recommend changes, share ideas for the team, or ask for the things that we needed to do our jobs. The other important piece was he was never afraid to say, I don't know. In technical teams, that can be a really scary thing to do. There always seems to be this sense of, at least for me, I think I should already know that, so I don't want to look stupid by asking. When you have a leader who's willing to say, I don't know, or maybe just ask the stupid question, the rest of the team feels more comfortable doing the same. Team members become more comfortable with being vulnerable with each other. This builds a sense of belonging to the team. It does things like encourage learning, information sharing, and I think maybe most importantly, it helps prevent repeated mistakes. So the result of all this is it creates a vulnerability loop. Sharing vulnerability inside the team builds closeness and trust. It makes people more likely to be comfortable being vulnerable. And what you end up with is an increasingly cohesive team. So one last piece in talking about team communications, understanding how to make sure we're communicating the right information to the right people. Leaders and managers of a team will likely be focused on that strategic goal, those initiatives that Tom mentioned earlier. They'll have a clear sense of what's the bigger picture that the team is moving towards. And hopefully they'll be executing on actions that are moving the team towards those broader goals. But leaders have to strike a balance here. Every member of the team doesn't need full visibility into every detail of every meeting that management's having. That would be a huge waste of time. However, it is crucial that each member of the team understand what's their role and how does it fit into this bigger picture that we're talking about. How are these individual members contributing to that team's success? When each member feels like they understand how their efforts help the group, everyone's more dedicated to the group's success. And this creates a stronger sense of belonging. Kind of a piece that goes right along with that is, individual team members will likely be focused on tasks associated with their specific roles. Now, you probably don't need to call your boss every 30 minutes to tell them exactly what you're doing, but you do have responsibility as a member of a team to make sure your boss knows what you're working on. And kind of an example that I pulled out of my everyday experiences, hey, my boss sends me a Slack message asking me, hey, are you working on task A for XYZ project yet? Maybe this is just me, but sometimes my first reaction is, I get a little irritated. I feel like maybe I'm being hassled about getting work done. But, on a little contemplation, I think that the correct reaction is to understand my boss needs good visibility into what I'm up to. And if he has to ask me, it means I failed in my job to keep him informed. I need to think about what can I do better, because if they're having to ask, then I fell down somewhere. Another part of building a team is hiring. Obviously, hiring is a super tough and complex topic that may be best in some elements left to more expert people. But in terms of building a cohesive team, there are a few, I think, easier things you can do to improve the overall process. You always want to ensure the highest level of rigor possible. Making the process challenging is really important. And now I do want to differentiate here, just through my years of going through the hiring process and doing interviews. Making the process challenging is not the same thing as just throwing a ton of arbitrary knowledge questions at someone. I think if you really think about it, you can come up with challenges that require, your prospective hire to do some sort of problem solving, so you can see them work through an issue, see how they perform under pressure. And what you get is a tough hiring process builds this sort of shared sense of suffering, which builds a sense of belonging to the team. If you go through a really rigorous hiring process, as soon as you join, you feel like, hey, I made it. We all made it. So we all went through the same sort of gauntlet. So we belong to the team now. Another piece is involving the team in the hiring process. When team members get a say in who's being hired, they get a feeling of being invested in the overall quality of the team. And it also means that because they've already been exposed and helped choose, new hires get more easily accepted into the group. Underperformers, again, it can be a really tough subject, and maybe probably the subject of its own set of books and research projects. But I think there's a couple of general examples that we can touch on that will give some insight. The first type of underperformer I call the deadbeat. This is an individual that has skill and ability to perform, but isn't making the effort, isn't committed to the team's success. In these situations, this is an individual who needs to become invested in the team success over their own, at least. And if you encounter this type of person, I think one of the sort of general attacks you can take is attempt to engage them and understand what's the source of their apathy. Why are they so disconnected, or why aren't they giving the real effort? A sort of side path you can take with that same idea in mind is give this person responsibility. Put them in a leadership position so that they're tied to the success or failure of a project. And often what you'll see is someone goes from being disinterested to being fully interested, and you start to get the best out of them. The second type of underperformer is someone who may be missing the skills or knowledge they need to succeed. They're just not meeting the goals that are set for them. If you are responsible for someone like this, I think one thing that I'd recommend to everyone, and this applies to a lot of places, but if you're a leader, you need to maybe be honest with yourself. Before you start canceling or mentoring someone about not doing what they're supposed to, make an honest self-assessment. Did you really do an effective job communicating with this person? Did they deeply understand their role, their responsibilities, and most importantly, the expectation? Most people need to have something communicated to them clearly more than once before it really sticks. Make sure that give them opportunities to ask questions so that they are focusing on what you think they are. Make sure underperformers have their expectations spelled out for them so that they can focus on doing the right things. The next step is kind of an evil word in the business world, and that is micromanaging. But I think in some sense, this really just means you're taking a more detailed role in oversight to mentor someone who's struggling. Maybe they're missing some critical skills. So this is an opportunity for that person to learn. And once they've proven that they've mastered those skills over time, they can go back to operating with more autonomy. Kind of the follow-up here that is, I think, equally critical is if you're quick to fire or discipline someone when a mistake is made or someone's not performing, you can destroy team cohesion. So make sure that when you're thinking about this, you're giving people an opportunity to improve and not just going straight to firing. Because if people feel like, oh, just because I made a mistake, I'm going to get fired, you have zero team cohesion. People will act in a way that only serves their best interest and not the interest of the team. All right, leading. Just like the last two topics, the subject of massive amounts of research and books, and you probably a lifetime just talking about this particular topic. But there's a couple of things I think that we can focus on as leaders in red teams. I think the first is everyone can be a leader. You don't have to wait for someone to always designate you to be in charge. If you have two people working together, there's an issue that needs to be addressed and isn't being addressed, that's a chance to step up and take charge of something. Now, the Marine Corps focuses hard on teaching this idea from day one. There's a massive focus on small unit leadership and solving issues at the lowest possible level. Your Marines are trained to step up or follow someone in solving an issue as soon as that issue is recognized. In the red team world, that might not always be prudent to just jump up and start barking orders. Probably your first reaction would be from your team, who the hell is this guy? Why is he telling me what to do? So as an alternative, when you see one of these issues comes up that seems like it's right for someone taking charge and getting something done, take time to really consider it. Ensure everyone recognizes this is an issue that needs to be addressed, and give other people a chance to propose solutions. Then after everyone recognizes what the issue is and it's you really thought out what is my solution and how would I deliver it, that's when you can go to the process of starting to implement it or presenting it. A side warning here, I've noticed that when you spend a lot of time coming up with solutions to big issues, you can become emotionally invested in them. So when one of these things comes up, if someone else presents an idea, your first reaction might be to dismiss it. If you're in a leadership position, it's important to let others take charge of getting things done when possible. Just because that solution is different than what you would do, if it works, try to give them the opportunity to get things done. So what to do when a leader isn't leading? Well, we touched on it a little bit in that last slide. When you see a problem that isn't being addressed, that is a chance to step up. But another situation you might encounter is a leader that can't focus or prioritize on the team's activities. So, I think a lot of people recognize when you try to do everything, you end up doing nothing. And this is one of the places where tact as a team member really comes into play. Spend time considering what tasks best align with the strategic direction of your team. What things will move the needle the most in the direction it needs to go. Then after that, develop your own list of prioritized tasks and present it to your boss or the leader in a tactful manner as your own action plan. Offer to take charge of getting these things done, but be ready to justify why did you prioritize these things the way that you did. So in summary here, look for opportunities to help solve problems the team is facing. Also look for chances to improve the culture of good communication within your organization. Make it okay to say, I don't know, and be cognizant of communicating up and down the chain of command. Make sure people have situational awareness where they need it. All right, our final section is approaching the mission. We've defined the larger strategic goal, tactical mission. We've got everyone moving in the same direction. We've assembled our team. Now it's time to take action and accomplish the objectives. This is where the project life cycle comes into play. That is on the screen there, communicating intent, planning, preparation, execution, and review. So talking about communicating intent, as we touched on in the first section, communicating intent is the combination of the purpose or the why, along with the desired end state or goal. When we communicate this, it serves two purposes. One, we get faster, improved decision-making for your operators. If everyone understands the real intent of the mission, they can more easily make judgment calls about which risks are worth taking, which aren't. When do I need to go to my leadership to ask for help or permission? We also build a hive mind mentality. We call this the Borg framework. If we have a shared mental model, we can anticipate our teammates' actions and prepare and respond accordingly. Going on to planning, what are we trying to achieve when we talk about planning for a red team engagement? When you start planning, you were trying to explore the ways in which you might achieve that desired end state. You also want to account for contingencies that we might encounter during operation. For example, obviously this is a really cut down version, but in this test, we're going to focus on initial access via phishing. What are the ways we might go about this? And in terms of contingencies, what processes do we put in place if we get caught? This is a really great opportunity to get input from the team on how you're going to solve these challenges and to delegate some of these planning pieces to your team members. Once a plan has been designed, it's critical that everyone knows the entire plan, specifically their role in that plan. On your screen here, you see Marines standing around a terrain model. This is a really common tool used in operation planning, and it's nice because you can visualize an entire area of operations in one place. But a change you need to consider from red teaming is, in red teaming, you don't have the full view of the terrain. Your view of the terrain you're operating on is going to develop as the engagement progresses. So your plan needs to account for this process of generating a broader plan for the engagement, then having a more detailed phase of planning that's going to be conducted as new information is gathered. Once you have your initial planning done, there's several facets of preparation that are important for good execution, but the one I think that has probably the greatest impact from engagement to engagement, and that is standard operating procedures. These give a team a baseline from which to operate. Now, I've noticed that sometimes this concept gets a little bit of resistance because people don't like the idea of feeling restricted or being told how to do things. And it's true that creating a high quality, consistent operation across a team may require members give up a little bit of just doing things however they want to do them. But on reflection, a good standard operating procedure should be like a Lego brick of team agreed upon best operating practices. When you fit them all together in different ways, you can build really cool stuff with relative ease instead of having to recreate a new Lego brick for every time you want to add something on. An example of this in practice is the Marine Corps has a lot of standard operating procedures, as I'm sure you can imagine, a military favorite. But one common element in the Marine Corps is a squad. A squad has a leader. A squad trains to do things like direct fire on a designated target. And they also train how to adjust fire onto a new target. And how this is done is all documented in SOPs somewhere, in lots of books and field manuals. And that's really important because everyone knows exactly what the steps are that lets them work together. Imagine that a squad leader is instructing that squad to adjust rifle fire from target 1 to target 2. Without a sort of agreed upon standard, that would be a really dangerous and ineffective process. But with training and SOPs, the squad can be agile and effective in these types of high-stress circumstances. In the red team world, these SOPs take on a different form that play the same role. For example, let's say your team does a lot of phishing, part of their initial access, or maybe they're very frequently standing up C2 servers. In both cases, it's really important you have a standard for how are these servers going to be set up and how are they going to be configured, because you want to ensure that the servers are secure and effective for whatever their intended purpose is. This also prevents operators from having to invent new server configs every time they go through this process, which can be time consuming and also leaves more places for people to make errors. Having this standardized and documented creates seamlessness in your operation between gigs, increases the team consistency and quality. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Tom.
So I moved into the execution portion of the engagement. And here it's important to remember that communication is absolutely vital, especially if you're part of a remote team. No one enjoys working with that guy that you have to go and pester for status updates. And that can happen with red teaming, where people disappear for maybe days at a time because they're building a payload. They're chasing some thread that might lead to remote code execution. So establish up front, say, hey, 6 hours from now, let's reconvene, let's check our progress, kind of detach, figure out where we need to allocate our resources next. Where you can, try to automate your actions. So we utilize things like webhooks. So if you're using things like Teams or Slack, write into your scripts, whatever you're working on, if you're deploying infrastructure, if you get a shell, whatever it may be, if some event occurs, push that to your central communication platform so everybody can stay up to date on what you're doing. One of the important lessons I learned early in my career was to document as you go. So I've been on engagements where I find something interesting and then I dig into it and then I pick my head up and it's 6 hours later and I've jumped through 5 systems. I've compromised a bunch of accounts and I didn't document any of it. And now I have to go back and write a report. And that's extremely difficult to do. So document the IP addresses, the host names, the accounts that you compromised, the systems that you touched, what artifacts did you drop, what are the hashes of those artifacts, things that you'll have to report on later, and also things that might help you in your attack cycle. If your pacing allows, try to write the report as you go. And that's something it's difficult to do and something that takes discipline to actually get into your workflow. It can be very rewarding, especially it helps you identify gaps. So if you realize you're missing a screenshot, and I was taking one of John Strand's SANS classes, and John, I don't know if he's on the talk, but maybe he can keep me honest here. One of the things he taught us was when you get into a new environment, don't try to think of it like you're trying to hack a system. Think about it as an information collection exercise. You want to learn as much as you can about the environment because we as humans are good at pattern recognition. There was times where I find a piece of data on day 1 or day 2 of engagement. And then I don't know exactly what to do with it yet. So I hang on to it. And then as I progress, maybe I get towards the end of my engagement, I'm looking for that last piece to push me over the edge. And then if I've documented it well, I can go back and reference that data. I see that pattern and I can extrapolate out from there. And maybe that will hit me or allow me to hit my objective. Automate things like setting up your command line logging. Make sure you're recording all your web logs. You want to be in a position where it can, if a client asks you for that kind of data, maybe you're doing deconfliction or something like that, where you can provide that stuff. You do not want to learn that lesson the hard way. Even the most savvy leaders can get overwhelmed as information changes and as circumstances change. If you try to tackle too many problems at once, chances are all of your efforts are going to fail. So have a plan in place that's prepared for those likely contingencies that might pop up. So identify the highest priority risk and focus your attention on that task till it's complete or at least has solid momentum, and then move on to the next high priority task. And then lastly, just by nature of red teaming, it carries a lot of inherent risk. So, dropping and executing a payload in the system or touching a production application can be dangerous. And the key to remember here is that you want the risk that your operators take to align with the objective of the mission and not necessarily to their own personal curiosity. So to give an example, what if you're on an engagement where you come across maybe a legacy web application sitting in production? And maybe you want to inject into the application's process memory. Maybe you can pull out some sessions that are sitting there, or maybe some credentials that are in there. Would that be cool? Yeah, maybe. Is that the best path to actually get you closer to achieving your objective? Well, maybe not. If you take that legacy application down, one, that might expose your position on the network. Two, it's probably going to impact your customer. What does that say to their bottom line? What is that going to do for the relationship that you've built and fostered with that customer for years? So remember to be professional, remember the team's overall goal, and to operate with integrity. And one of the last pieces in the life cycle, and one of the most important, is the review process. And if I have a chance to talk about Greg Maddux, I'm going to talk about Greg Maddux. So for those of you unfamiliar, he is a Hall of Fame pitcher. He has 4 Cy Young Awards. He has 18 Gold Gloves, still a Major League Baseball record. He pitched for the Braves through their run of 14 consecutive division titles throughout the 90s, and a handful of other teams throughout his career. He got the nickname The Professor, and it was partially because of these kind of goofy glasses he would sometimes wear when he pitched. It was mostly because when he went out there to pitch every 5th day, it was like he was putting on a pitching clinic, and he could teach. It's like he was teaching everyone else, this is how you do it. But it was also partially because Greg Maddux used this really intensive review process. So after an outing, he would sit down and he would look at images and videos like this, and he would say, okay, I'm landing about 5 stride lengths in front of the rubber. My chest is out over a bent front knee. I've brought my chest to the glove, kept my shoulder in so my head doesn't pull off, and I'm going to throw this 2-seam fastball so it breaks back in over the outside corner. And then he would take these, look at these actions and look at the results. He'd sit down with his catcher and his pitching coach, and even the other pitchers on the staff, and they would look at their approach, what was working and what wasn't. Now, his pitching coach, Leo Mazzoni, said, yeah, he was called the professor, and on the 5th day, he would show that. But on those 4 days in between starts, he was a student of the game. He was analyzing how all the other pitchers were approaching hitters and how they were getting their outs. They would analyze the strategies and tactics that were working and weren't. So this is what a guy did at the pinnacle of the sport. Even though his talent got him to that level, his yearning just to keep improving himself is what kept him there. So how do we apply that in a red team sense? Well, we utilize something called after action reviews, or AARs. It's a term that we've borrowed from the military, just like red teaming. And they're often overlooked, but it's just as critical. And the idea behind it is kind of what Patrick said earlier about building a shared mental model. The outcome of this is to hopefully bring new hires up to speed quicker and eliminate tribal knowledge. So the idea is you get everyone to execute on the engagement, to come together, and you work through the engagement chronologically. Here are all the big decisions we made, here are the big actions we took, and you let the people that actually did the work lead that conversation. And you focus on improvements for the next mission. For these environments, you switch off seniority, you switch on humility, and you aim for high candor. The questions you ask are, what was the expected outcome? And what was the actual outcome? If there was a difference between those two, why was there a difference? And explore that. Ask yourself what went wrong and why, and what went right and why. If something went wrong, why did it go wrong? And how can you improve upon that for the next iteration? If something went right, is there some pattern in there that you can extrapolate out and apply to other processes? And then a little red team flair to this. Throughout the course of engagement, did you write any tools? Did you develop or modify any TTPs as part of it? If so, let's contribute those back to our internal code repositories. Let's write a blog post. Let's put something on our internal wiki. Now, I've been in a position, maybe you guys have too, where you come into a new environment and you're talking with the other guys in the team and you start hearing this lingo being thrown around. They're referencing tools that you've maybe never heard of, and they're acting and operating in a way that just doesn't make sense to you. And you realize that there was this kind of tribal knowledge that existed before you got there. But if you have this repository of AARs, these members can go look at this repository and they see a tool reference. They go, okay, the genesis of this tool was from this engagement 2 years ago. The context of it was this, and it was to combat this specific technology. Now you understand why they operate the way they do, and it can help those newcomers come up to the standard that you've set. So key takeaways from this last section: if you have members of your team that seem a little more critical of leadership or the mission, or if you see that they're just not invested in what's going on, chances are they might not have been involved in the planning process. So try to get them involved. Give them, even if it's just a small little piece, let them take ownership of that. It allows them to it satisfies that kind of natural craving we have as humans to have some autonomy and control over what we're doing, and allows them to buy in a little more. Secondly, if you don't have playbooks, create them. And if you do have playbooks, continue to develop them. And this was a concept that really hit home with me when I was listening to Carlos Perez's DerbyCon 2016 talk called Thinking Purple. And in that talk, he mentions that organizations that don't have playbooks and don't develop them, they contribute to that culture of tribal knowledge. And it makes you dependent upon those senior people that have developed the tools and the TTPs that your team uses. And then lastly, find the time to review the actions and the results of those actions from your engagements. Conduct those AARs, even if it's just a half hour or an hour. And you don't necessarily need the leaders to be present. You need the people that operate in engagement there. This will add significant value to those new team members and bring everyone up to that same standard. So what makes a red team effective? Well, it's a combination of all the things that Patrick and I have been talking about the last hour. But if we had to boil it down to one word or one idea, we'd say it's culture. You want to build a culture that shares vulnerability and builds safety, establishes purpose, exercises discipline, and takes ownership. And if you beacon these principles, others will follow and your team will be more effective. Here's a list of references. Feel free to screenshot that if you want. We'll also post this in Discord. And with that, I'd like to thank you all come out to the virtual talk.